Hello, beautiful souls, and a warm welcome back to the Surrey Art School studio as we prepare to embark on cycle 3 of our winter season theme, A Winter's Tale. And what a journey it has been so far. I am so thankful to all of you for the little gifts of light that you have offered up over the dark days of January, all the beautiful imaginative responses that you have rippled back to me. It really is such a joy to share this creative space with you. So I wanted to have a look at a part of the Dear Mother story that talks about her travelling south and bringing back the light in her antlers. So we're going to begin by just looking at antlers themselves, and there are a few little technical aspects of drawing antlers or recording antlers that I wanted to tackle today. So we start with just a simple pencil study of a fairly simple pair of antlers. And then we have a little look at symmetry in antlers. They're not perfectly symmetrical, but I offer up a little hack for how to make sure that your antlers are nicely balanced from left to right. And hacks are absolutely acceptable part of Sketchbook Club. And then finally, I show a couple of options for how you might want to work with sort of simple skeleton line drawing and sort of flesh it out into a full antler study. So we work with some pastels, some pastel pencils, some ink, and then also just the chalk pencils that we've been working with so far this season. So just a couple of ideas there, just for those of you that might be finding things like the antlers a little bit trickier to do. And then in the second part of this cycle, I really wanted to give a nod to the returning sun. We are still in the dark and quite grey days of winter when I look outside, and I just thought it would be really fun to invite in the inner child and to think about different ways that we might portray the sun in our sketchbooks. So I offer up a few suggestions during the cycle, some fun ideas of how you might represent the sun. But I invite you to have some fun with this one, just because it's so good for the soul. Just working with some warm watercolours, some warm-toned watercolours, maybe working with some warm-toned pastels if you want to. You can work with gouache, I really don't mind. We use a little bit of the gold paint from your subscription box if you want to have a play with that today. But the invitation really is just to fill your pages with sunshine and to, you know, delight your inner child, I suppose, in the process. There is no right or wrong way of recording the sun, and I think that's what makes it lots and lots of fun. It's something, you know, the sun is something we would have included in most of our drawings as children, so I really want you to connect to that inner child today and invite in that sense of play. And we don't have to have a conclusion to this cycle today. It is just a series of experiments, and we will bring in some of those techniques a little bit later on in the season. But for today, the invitation, as always, is simply to play, to experiment with whatever materials you've got to hand at home, and to sort of tune into that part of the story, the dear mother returning with the sun and bringing back spring. My kind of thing. So much love. Okay, my loves, we are now nearly halfway through our project. How exciting. And today I wanted to look at two things. First of all, I wanted to look at antlers because we haven't really explored those in detail yet. And secondly, I wanted to come out of the cave and look at the sun. So we know in the Dear Mother story that in one of the variations of the story, the dear mother brought back the sun in her antlers. And I just want to play with that idea today as a sort of boundary for how we work through this cycle. So we're going to start by just looking at some antler sketching techniques, something to just get you going, and a few different materials for that. And then we're going to explore the sun. And then if we have time, we're going to bring them all together because that sounds like fun to me. Okay, so let's find a page and let's make a start. Okay, so I've got a load of printed out antlers on here, and you will have these in the resources too. I'll put the image of the one that I'm working on here to make it a little bit easier for you. And there's a few things that are challenging about sketching antlers, I think. Number one, the fact that they're quite light. That can be quite challenging in terms of working with them with, say, a pencil, which is what we're going to do today. And number two, it's sort of the balance and the proportion from left to right. So whatever we do on the left-hand side needs to be mirrored on the right. And there are a few different ways that we can make that happen in order to ensure that our antlers are balanced, okay? So let's just start with this first image with the very simple horns. And the first thing you need to do on your page is you're going to draw a line down the middle. That's going to help you to see whether or not your antlers are balanced from left to right. And then I'm going to make like a little semicircle shape as well. I'm going to try and keep that even from left to right. And sort of little semicircles to show where the antlers are coming out of the head. So hopefully you can see that. So to begin with, on the right hand side, I'm just going to draw the shapes that I can see. So I can see an antler going up here, and I can see a longer one sitting behind, which is going out a little bit further. And then I'm just going to draw a line for that extra little horn that is sticking out. Okay, so that's it to begin with. Now what we need to do is make sure that our antlers are balanced. So using that line as a guide, if I start at the top, I can mimic that angle. And it doesn't have to be perfect, nature is not perfect. But if we can get roughly the same measurement from left to right, so if I measure from here to the edge of the antler, I can give myself a little mark around here. That's just going to make sure that I have the best possible chance of making sure that my right antler is a similar angle and shape to my left one. And then again, I'm going to follow that shape there. So just a line drawing to begin with, just to sort of make sure that we've got everything in the right place. And then once we've done that, we can start to widen our antler a little bit. So I'm just going to go around the edge of that drawing, of that line, and I'm going to thicken it. So these antlers, they're sort of quite pointy at the ends, and they widen as they get towards the base. So we just want to sketch that in lightly to begin with, okay? And the same on the other side, we try and get it so it's mirroring. And so although they're pointy, they do have a sort of soft edge, and we can sort of find the edges of those semicircles to make sure that that's in place correctly. And then these back antlers, exactly the same. So I want to find the edge, just using that line as a guideline to follow that edge down and tuck this antler behind the other one. Knowing that they get a little bit wider towards the base. And then this little area that's sticking out here, we make like a little semicircle and then sketch out from there. We can see how that joins, okay? And then just paying attention to the angles really as we create that join. And the same on the other side. We're just going to go up and build that up. So lots of little lines can help here. Just finding our way through that shape. And then again, adding that extra little horn sticking out from the side. Okay? So there we have fairly balanced antlers from left to right. You can sort of see they are fairly in proportion. Don't worry about removing the lines for this one. We're now just going to go in with the side of our pencil, and it does need to be horizontal with the page. And we're just going to add a little bit of tone to our drawing. So by which I mean I'm just going to darken it a little bit because it's really light at the moment. And that's not actually particularly helpful for us. We need a little bit darker so it can actually be visible on the page. So just adding some tone, covering up the lines that we've already made. And then blending that off with a blender. So it's really, really light tone. I'll speed this up for you a little bit, but I'm just blending, just softening off that pencil work. Okay, so now we have something which is pretty monotone, and we're going to work into it a little bit. So we just need something to make it sort of visible. So you'll notice between the front and the back antlers, there's a little bit of a shift in tone. There's a little highlight on the edge of these front antlers, and then it's a little bit darker behind them, and that's how we can see one from the other. So let's go a little bit darker here. And actually in that edge area with our rubber, we can pick out a little bit of light. So a little bit of a highlight. And that's just going to make one area stand out from the other. So the only way we can really see things is because we have a dark area next to a light area. Now all the tone is quite subtle in this, especially when we're working this sort of dark onto a light background. But that sort of gives you the idea of how we can see one antler from the other. So whatever antlers you're drawing, however they're overlapping, you just need to make sure that one area is lighter and the other one is darker, so that you can see one from the other. So there's that definition. So very simple, really. Okay, so now I think just work our way through and add a few little highlights. So again, the very end of my antler here is quite light, so I'm going to use my rubber to take out a little bit of that graphite. And there's a little bit of lightness on the back of this one, so I'm going to lift that out. And the same here, it's actually a little bit lighter up here, and a little bit lighter up here. And the same on this one. So we're sort of working out all the lightest areas now. We've put sort of the darkest areas in that we can see, and we're just figuring out the lighter areas. And then go back and just sort of tidy up that bit of the drawing just with an outline. So now that we've got that basic tone down, we can actually start to add some texture to this drawing. So that will really help us to see that it's an antler. So right here at the bottom, we can take our pencil on its side and we can just sort of wiggle it and leave some gaps. That will show us the sort of base of the antler. And actually you may want to sort of rework some of that pencil to add a little bit of texture. Just using the side of your pencil so it's nice and soft. And then on this last part of the drawing, we're going to look really, really closely. There are some little bits of line on there. There are some little bits of texture, especially on this front antlers. And we're just going to sort of mimic that with our marks. So I'm going to use the end of my pencil. And I don't want too much mark making here, but I do want to show there's some texture. So lots of little tiny marks can be really helpful. The odd, slightly stronger line. This is the only time that we use the very end of our pencil is when we're starting to try and build up some texture. And the same on the other side. I press quite heavily in some areas. I'm just going to add little bits of texture in others. Just sort of scrubbing. And those sort of tones that we laid before sort of sit underneath and create something a little bit more realistic. It's all very subtle with these white antlers. There's not it's not something we'd be able to see in a lot of detail. So we're just sort of giving an impression of. And again, if you come across any areas where you can see a little bit of extra shadow, do accentuate that. So there's a little bit of shadow cast on these little inside horns. And a little bit of shadow cast here. And a little bit here. So it just really is about adding some mark making, adding some little bits of texture now, just to make those antlers pop a little bit more. And it can be lots of little tiny marks, tiny lines, and a few maybe just slightly longer. Marks just to show that texture on the surface. So this wasn't really intended to be an exercise in tone, more an exercise in understanding how you can balance the drawing from left to right when it comes to drawing these antlers. But it's quite a fun little experiment to do as well, I think. It's a little one that can sort of draw you in, and it sort of encourages us to look a little bit more closely at the antlers, at the shape of them, but also sort of the light and dark on them. So I'm going to leave that little drawing there because it's just a little initial sketch, and then we're going to have a go at doing some other variations and slightly more complicated antler shapes. So I'm going to reset and I shall come back and work on that with you. Okay. Okay, so that's a very simple antler shape, I suppose. But what if we wanted to have a go at something a bit more complex? So what if we wanted to have a go at something like this one above here, which is a little bit more of a complicated shape? Well, my advice would be exactly the same, really, which is just with a little variation. So get your pencil, draw your line down the middle again. And it's important to note with these antlers that they're not exactly sort of the same from left to right. So you don't have to be perfect with this. But what I would do to begin with is just find that shape on that left-hand side. So again, I'm just going to really lightly with my pencil, just follow the shape of the antler until it gets to that sort of bit where it splits. And then I'm going to split off in one direction, and I'll split off the other way too, and then each one of these parts of the antler forks off as well. And just laughing at fork off. That is how mature I am, my friends. So that gives you a sort of base outline, and then you can either just sort of try and mirror that from left to right. That is absolutely fine. It just sort of needs to work sort of section by section, really. And sometimes it can make your brain hurt. I'm just warning you of that. So we can even sort of draw little lines to help us get to the same place and then sort of bring it back in again. And just keeping an eye again on that measurement from left to right, just knowing it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be roughly in line. So that's one option. And then the other option is to simply use some tracing paper. So if you've got your sort of line, say that's your line down the middle at the edge of the tracing paper, you can then come in, trace what you've got on one side, and then just flip it over exactly, and you will get the mirror image. So again, I'm sort of championing, and actually we can see how close to the mirror image I got there. I'm sort of championing this idea of using things like tracing paper as a tool, just to sort of speed up the process and to give us the opportunity to play a little bit quicker. So there we go. We can see I was almost there, actually. I was only ever so slightly off. So you can play around with this as well. See how close your mind is to sort of what's down there on the paper. But that just gives us a nice little mirror image to work with really quite quickly. So just a little tip for me. And then obviously you need to go through the sort of thickening process again if you wanted to make that into a pencil study. But I'm not going to do that just right now. What I'm going to do is suggest that we actually lay a ground on this opposite side, something that we can work on, and then we have a go at doing a few different studies in different materials. So again, you can make this ground black or you can make it brown. I'm going to put mine down as a sort of burnt umber ground, and I'm not going to sort of do it wet on wet. I'm just going to lay a very flat ground here. So I'm just going to do that quickly and I'll be back. Okay, so we've got a nice blank page to work with here to have a little bit of a play with antlers, to do some little studies. Maybe we'll do one little close-up one. We'll see how we go. Now, I already had a tracing, or a partial tracing, from this drawing that I'd done here. So just for speed and ease, I'm just going to use my carbon paper, pop my antlers over the top, just so that I've got them sort of balanced in proportion left to right, and a sort of framework to work from here, and just trace down those lines. There we go, so I've got like a nice light tracing of that. And then for this one, I'm just going to work with just a little ivory toned pastel pencil, and I'm just going to use that to thicken these lines now a little bit so that we can see them better. So let's get that original image just up beside us so we can see what we're doing here. And I'm literally just going to come in and work around those existing white lines and thicken from there. So it's the same as what we were doing with the pencil, really, but I'm just doing it with a pastel pencil and just using that carbon paper outline just to help me. And again, I'm really championing the use of things like carbon paper. It's going to come in useful, I think, in the later parts of these tutorials as we move into sort of coming up with compositions as well. And it's just a much quicker way than like continuously redrawing. So it just sort of helps us to skip a few stages in the sort of illustration process. So same on this one, I'm just thickening it up a little bit. Just chunking it out. And you could do this whatever materials you're working with, really. I'm going to do one like this, and maybe I'll do one in a wet material as well, just so we've got a little bit of something different going on. And I just think the more we draw and redraw these shapes as well, the more familiar we become with them. So that's sort of coming together there now. Just need to maybe just sort of echo the thickness a little bit of this one here, curve it off a little bit more, and bring the same sort of curve in on this side. They are actually quite chunky, these antlers, so we want to chunk them out. There we go. And to be honest, on that dark ground, it's not going to need a huge amount more. It's not going to need a huge amount more to make it look like an antler. I sort of quite like it as it is, to be honest, because they are pretty light, or the ones we've been looking at so far are pretty light. Make sure that your antlers are nice and pointy at the ends, because that does make a difference. And make sure that you soften off these areas where they sort of join, because that's also really important. But yeah, we easily could have spent a whole tutorial drawing antlers, and I didn't really want that for us. I want to do some other experiments with the sunshine later on. So if you want to carry that on and add the base of the antlers, you can. Some semblance of the skull, you can, but you don't have to. It's just that getting that sense of sort of the difference between working on a light surface like just sort of plain white paper and a dark one. And then all we need to do is add in a little bit of striation here. So I'm going to add some extra little thinner lines just using my burnt umber pastel pencil. Need to make sure it's fairly sharp for this. And you can use it as a sort of shadow tone. So down the edge of this antler here is a shadow tone. Down the back of this one is a sort of shadow tone. But you can also add it to add just little marks, little bits of texture. And just sort of following the contours of the antler. Very much like tree bark or something like that, I find the antlers. Really interesting texture. And if you want something a lot darker, so there are some areas here which are a little bit more textured, then you can go a little bit deeper just with a charcoal pencil. So I'm just adding some little much darker areas with a charcoal pencil. Just the areas where it's particularly textured. There we go, and get some nice fine lines in there. Sort of working those over the top. So our light is the white or the cream. Our mid-tone is the brown, and then we can use a little hint of black just for those extremely sort of shadowy areas. So there's a particularly extreme shadow just along the edge here. So I can add that in. Yep. And then if it gets too dark, you can always work back over the top and sort of blend in using your pastel pencil. So that's a real quick antler study, nicely balanced left to right, leading with the light this time rather than with the dark. And if I've got time, I'll squeeze one more of those in. And then we will start to look at some sunshine. Okay. Okay, so we have got room for one more little study here, and I'm going to give you the option about what you want to do with this last study. And again, I'm going to give you permission to just, trace down the outline with carbon paper. I'm going to use my black carbon paper and just pop in just the outlines for this particular antler here. And then I'm going to go in with some black ink, put that down as a base, and then add some materials to it. The reason being that I want us to get to a point where we've got the antlers and then potentially we've got the sun behind them. And so I think an actual silhouette of an antler would work really well for that. So I'm just going to very quickly copy that down. And then if you meet me back here just with some black drawing ink, then we'll have a crack at that. Okay? Okay, so I've just got my size 6 brush here. I've done a loose outline for myself, just the positioning of the antlers. And now I'm going to go through and create like an antler silhouette, just using my size 6 brush, which is a little bit damp but not wet, and some black drawing ink. So real simple. So I'll start up at the top here. And just leaving gaps where I know there's that other antler that overlaps. I can always tidy this up afterwards. I just want to make it look like it's one whole thing. And I might speed this up for you a little bit, just as I fill this in. So all we're doing is the same as we did with the chalk. There we go, I got there. Same as we did with the chalk, we're just thickening those lines now. And the nice thing about the brush is it gives you a really nice point at the end of the antler as well. So if you point your brush away, you get a nice pointy edge of your antler. And these antlers are actually really thick, so just honour that, especially at the base, they're really thick. Making sure they join in a nice organic way. And then putting in those horns. And we'll just let that dry. Okay, so one last quick little experiment here. This time I've just done a sort of black silhouette of one of the antlers on our worksheet. And now I just need to work the light back on top, so it's sort of the opposite way around, I suppose. So we're going to give it some nice light tips. And just sort of scratchy mark making, a little bit like we were doing with the other one. So, and sort of blending a little bit, little light bits of texture through the base. And I want to particularly focus on these areas where the antlers sort of overlap, because I think that's really important. So I'm going to bump those up with some white over the top of that dark ground, just to really make those ones at the front sit forward. But I can still add a little bit of light to the back antlers too. Just getting that sense of that definition between one area and the other here. And again, you might want to start by working some light over the top and then adding a little bit more shadow with the charcoal once we've worked the light in. So again, I'm going to make this tip nice and light. Just helps to have something to bat against, really, rather than a completely light surface. So again, just making sure that that antler really looks like it's sitting behind. Leaving a little gap in my mark making just so that we get that definition between the front and the back. And again, you could have done the whole of this with just chalk and charcoal, I suppose. I just thought it was quite nice to paint in ink for a change. And again, these very tips of these antlers are going to be quite white. So there's so many different variations you could do of this. You could do a painted sort of watercolour version. There are loads of options. I don't have time to explore them all, but you have plenty of space to experiment if you would like to. A little slightly sharper pencil probably would have been good here. But anyway, so there we go. So there's all the sort of light put in onto the dark. Just making sure I've covered that as much as I want to. And then again, I can just go in and sort of create mid-ish tones or more little bits of texture just using my charcoal pencil here. So sort of accentuating that striation. And here, wherever it's brown, I'm going to just darken it to black, but just leaving those nice light white tips. And that sense of darkening a little bit the back antlers, just so that the ones in front really, really pop. And let me just lighten up those tips as well. So yeah, you can play endlessly with this. I think it's a good practice to practice just drawing the antlers. It's also important to remember that they are sort of organic shapes, so they're not going to be perfect and they're not going to be perfectly symmetrical either. So they're fairly forgiving in that respect, but it's just getting that sense of one overlapping from the other. And the best way to do that is sort of tonally, I think. So I just wanted to offer up a second suggestion on that page. I'm going to leave it there, but you are welcome to continue to play and experiment with that. Just nice to play around with different materials, and I'll let you decide which is your favourite process out of all of those. Okay, so I'm going to stop that there now and see what we have time to fit into the second half of this tutorial exploring antlers and hopefully some sunshine. So let's just start with some sunshiny colours, and I'm just using like an old ink pot and I'm going to draw around it just to give me that sort of circle outline, because life's too short for sketching perfect circles. So I'm going to pop a few of those just onto my sketchbook page. Should we say 4? Let's do 4. Doesn't really matter. Let's put 4 in, just so we've got a little guideline for ourselves to work within or without. So what different ways could we use and what different materials could we use to capture that idea? So we're the dear mother and we're catching the sun, and what does it look like? So let's start with a more sort of classical interpretation, shall we? That first circle, we're just going to wet it down on the inside. Be a little bit careful as you get to the edges of that sort of pencil sketch that you've created. But again, it doesn't have to be a perfect circle either. Just use that little circle as a guideline. And we're just going to put a little bit of water down. So this one, we're going to have a go a little bit of wet on wet. So just popping that water down, letting it soften into the page for a minute whilst we get some colours going. I'm going to go for like a classic sort of lemon yellow to begin with. Or just slightly warmer than lemon yellow, sorry, just the next one along, shall we say. Just feel like in the midst of winter, this sort of play with sunshine and inviting that light back in is really a mood booster, which is what I need to do. But also like takes us back to that sort of inner child. Do you remember when we used to sort of draw suns all the time? So what I'm doing is taking that quite thick pigment and dropping that in wet on wet. It's looking quite moony for a sun actually right now, but that's okay. That's okay. And just dropping in one colour. Now if you want to, maybe go for a slightly more orangey tone, something alongside that, or you can add a little bit of red in and mix a bit of red with your yellow. I'm just going to drop in a few little bits of warmth into that because it's just bringing me joy today. This is an exercise in joy. There we go. So a little bit of extra warmth just running through that. And this one, we're just going to let that dry. Okay, 1 sun, done. Okay, number 2, what could we do in order to give this idea of the sun? Well, the sun in the winter often appears as just sort of white, doesn't it? So we need something cooler to put around the edge of it. So this time I'm going to wet down the edge of my circle. So the outside, really loosely, doesn't have to be perfect. Like I said, we're not after perfection here, we're just playing. Going to give it a nice wide circle around it. You can make that into a square if you want to. I really don't mind. And we're just going to leave that sort of sunshine space white. And we're going to add in some cool tones. So you could use a bit of your indigo. You could use a bit of this Payne's blue-grey, which is really rather beautiful. And we're just going to drop that into the space around, sort of starting from the middle around the sun and just letting that paint move, shift, pull, do what it wants to. Not trying to be too controlled, really engage the spirit of that inner child in this. So you are just having a bit of fun with how you are showing the sun. So we're going to make that be nice and soft and just radiate out from that circle in the middle. There we go. Sun experiment number 2. Done. We do have some glittery paints and some other bits and bobs we can play with for this, but for now, let's just leave that like that. A winter sun number 2. Looks a bit like a moon. It could be either. Doesn't really matter. Okay. Sun number 3. What shall we do? Let's see. So that same vein of that cold winter sun, but I'm not actually going to wet this one this time. I'm just going to go back to that yellow, and I'm just going to start to build it out around the edge of that white circle. And this is quite a nice way of showing that sort of radiating light of the sun. So again, super loose. And be quite thick with your paint. And we're just radiating out from that center point, creating some beautiful warm light to warm our goggles on a cold winter's day. Lovely. It's so important to stay in a sort of playful state with creativity. I have to remind myself all the time. It's not that important. It's supposed to be fun, yeah. It's supposed to be fun. This is a form of play. Creativity is a form of play. So try not to take yourself or your art too seriously today, please. Okay, so there we go. Another beautiful radiating ball of light. And I'm just thinking here, thinking back to sort of like children's illustrations, again, ways that we might sort of capture the sun. It might be fun just to fold a sheet of paper towel and sort of lift out. Just some little rays coming out of our sun. So sort of working in reverse, just getting that sense of that radiating light just by lifting out a little bit. Doesn't have to be strong, this. Again, just for fun. Just like a few little, quite chunky, but little rays coming out from my sun there. Quite like that sort of shift in tone that you get from lifting out in this way. You know, and you could even pull a little bit. Move the pigment a little bit in this one. And then all we do is come and get rid of that little paper outline afterwards if we wanted to. Okay, so that's method number 3 of capturing the sun. What shall we do with this next one? Well, I was feeling something like a little bit looser here. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into that yellow, sort of cadmium yellow, and I'm just going to start to sort of create some little marks, almost like a little nest around that circle shape. And you can bring in other tones here. So I'm going to take a bit of orange, which I've got next door, orange from the next part of my palette, and sort of build up a sense of like a nested sun. Could be quite fun. I think it's still important or helpful to get that sort of sunshine shape in the middle. Also that circular shape in the middle. And maybe we even work into that afterwards, we'll see. But just having a bit of fun with this idea of the sun, inviting it in, just using the tip of my paintbrush here just to tickle and sort of semi-blend. But I want sort of some mark making here with my brush. So like, what might it look like on a really cold winter's day when the sun came blazing back in? And you'll see I've put some links to some illustrators, some different ways of recording the sun in the resources. Illustrators, really great inspiration for this winter project. So just gently blending, just using the end of my pencil, my brush, allowing myself to be super loose with this and just having some fun. Okay. Okay, my loves, so I'm sort of running out of time for this cycle today, but we've had a look at some antlers, and the invitation at the end of this cycle is to play, just to simply play with materials, to play with ways of representing the sun. And as I said before, I've included some artist examples in the resources. There is no right or wrong way to play with this. But yeah, I've done some little watercolour experiments. I've got a load more here, and I invite you to do the same. Just fill your pages with sunshine, not only because it's really good for the soul at this time of the year, but because it's fun and it will play into later cycles of the season as well. So a little bit of preparation there. So I will put some notes on some of the samples that I've created. I invite you to create your own too. You don't just have to work with watercolour. I know some of you already have been having a play with things like pastel or gouache. You know, it's wide open in terms of what kinds of materials you might want to play with. And if you sort of come up with something that you really enjoyed in your sketchbook, then the invitation is to then perhaps move on to some watercolour paper and have a look at different ways that you might represent the sun. Just using some slightly better quality paper makes such a difference, actually. So this is a little watercolory sun, the same technique that I used in the earlier part of the cycle, but just on watercolour paper. And obviously it's going to dry a little bit lighter, so you might need to do a couple of colours. But this is mine with a sunshine in the middle, and then I did one as well where there was just a sort of empty space for the sun. So this is just a chance to play and experiment at this stage. But there's one more thing I wanted to share with you before I finish this cycle, because again, it's another invitation to play something a bit fun. So this beautiful gold watercolour paint that we sent you, this iridescent gold, which is in your subscription boxes, works really, really well on a dark surface. And in fact, I was playing around with it for my own Christmas cards this year. And just especially this sort of dark surface with this tiny little glimmer of light. So this tiny little glimmer of light creeping in really made me think about this winter season and this inviting back the light that we're doing through our sketchbook experiments. So just wanted to show you how I made this really. So you can get the paint out, you can get the paint going just by adding a few drops of water to the little dot that we sent you, the little gold dot that we sent you. So give it a little minute to soften. And then when it comes to sort of working on a dark surface, So for this one, I just drew around like I did before and just painted directly onto the surface. And that was really nice. It gives you a really nice luminous glow. Could be a sun or a moon, really, couldn't it? And we'll sort of figure that out a little bit more as we go along. But also, just this is a really fun one, just sort of stamping the sun. So I'm just getting my paint ready. Just getting that so it's nice and loose. And then what I did for these ones is I just took an old jar and I painted around the rim of the jar with that lovely watercolour paint. And as I said, it works really well on a dark surface, and we're going to be sort of, you know, today's cycle was all about the light, and we're going to step into the night, into the darkness in the next cycle. So we'll be looking at sort of moons and stars and constellations and all that sort of beautiful imagery. So this could work quite well for that too. But I just wanted to share this little technique with you. So I'm just painting a little bit of this watercolour onto the rim of this jar, and then whatever black paper you've got to hand, really. You could put some black ink down in your sketchbooks again, or if you've still got a little sample of that black that we sent you, you could use that. Black watercolour paper works well for this as well. Paint on noir works well. So you've got a few options there. And essentially you're just going to take that little rim and press it down and hold it quite firmly. And it gives you this beautiful luminous ring of the sun as well, which I think is really, really nice. So just another little idea for a representation of the sun. This one I just did with a rigger brush, a sort of old-fashioned sort of, well, sort of reminds me of sort of weather symbols, I suppose, a little bit, and then I flicked a little bit of paint. So again, at the end of this cycle, the invitation is not to sort of find any solutions at this stage, but just open up the options and allow that inner child to creep in here and to play and to invite in the light and explore some different ways of representing the sun just in your sketchbooks for now. Nothing, it doesn't have to be perfect and concluded and complete, just an opportunity to play with this imagery of the sun and start to invite it into our sketchbooks as we invite back the light. And the light is returning. We have passed the darkest days now, my loves, and each day the days are getting a little bit longer and the sun is getting a little bit stronger. So I really hope you enjoy this exercise or the exercises that I've offered up today. You could also take the antlers and combine them with the sun if you want to, but we can also look at that in later parts of the season, so don't feel you have to. I know some of you have already played with that combination, so perhaps I'm just chucking in a few extra suggestions as to how you might play and develop between those two symbols, the antlers and the sun. But whatever you do, I hope you have lots of fun.